The engineering project was intended to develop a world-class interactive museum of technology showing the development of hydroelectric power generation at the turn of the 20th century. It was an idea developed by Jan Carr, an electrical engineer who at the time of its inception was a partner in the Amicus engineering firm in Waterloo, Ontario. To test the waters, a pilot project opened to the public in September 1982 in what was the decommissioned Toronto Power Station. The intention was for it to be patterned after the British Engineering in Brighton and Hove, England, whose theme was the history of steam power, whereas the one at Niagara Falls was intended to deal with water power. For various reasons, the project never got past the initial stages. In this video, we'll look at what was proposed in some depth. To set the stage, we'll look at the electrical power situation in Niagara Falls at the turn of the 20th century. This is a 1913 map of Niagara Falls. Water flows from the east on the right of the map. The Toronto Power Plant is located south of the Rankin Station. Notice that north is more or less the direction of flow of the river below the falls. In this map that shows the locations of power stations at the falls, north is to the left. The Adams plants are at the top of the map. These were deep wheel pit plants similar to Canadian Niagara's Rankin Generating Station and to Toronto Power. The Toronto Power Company's generating station was similar to the other power plants at Niagara that were located above the falls, with one exception. While the plants owned by the Niagara Falls Power Company, Adams number 1 and number 2, and the Rankin Station, were intended primarily to supply power locally, less than 20 miles distance or 32 kilometers, Toronto Power was built to deliver power to Toronto, a distance of 80 miles or 130 clicks. The Sholkoff stations, although older, were of a more conventional design, with the powerhouses located in the gorge at river level. This location was the site of the first use of power at Niagara Falls, most of which was direct mechanical, using shafts and pulleys for power transmission. There are plenty of photos of the Toronto Power building in which the river figures predominantly. Some photos even include wildlife, but there were few photos of what the Toronto Power Station looked like when it was in operation, particularly in the wheel pit and turbine deck areas. Shown here is a plan view of the generator hall. Water entered from the river and flowed through the screen house, where river debris was removed in the trash rack shown here on the left. In the generator hall was located the majority of the electrical equipment. Included here were the alternating current generators, plus an array of circuit protection and control equipment. This is a cross-section of the station looking downriver. The generator is shown at the top floor of the powerhouse, and the Niagara River intake at the right. The wheel pit, whose walls are lined with several courses of brick, was a deep slot cut into the rock to contain the penstock and the generator drive shaft. At the bottom of the wheel pit was the hydraulic turbine, which discharged its spent water into two circular channels that again discharged the water into the river below the falls. The plant's turbine was of a size large enough to be written about in Scientific American. So, We've had a brief look at the plant before the interior was gutted. Let's look at the changes that were being proposed. To determine the fate of Toronto Power, the Parks Commission commissioned a reuse study. Although the study was not particularly well written, it was not dated, there were no page numbers, and no list of sources, it did make some useful recommendations. Having said all that, we'll look at the executive summary first. The Toronto Power Generating Station study was commissioned by the Ontario Heritage Foundation to develop alternatives to the Garden Monument proposal, which came out of a 1984 Ontario Hydro feasibility study. 3 alternatives were proposed. The first was the Garden Monument proposal. It involved construction of an Ontario Hydro Visitors Interpretive Centre in the central core of the building and demolition of the roof and rear walls of the wings of the building. The steering committee met to consider 6 alternatives which had been prepared and selected 2 alternatives which were to be developed further for comparison with the Garden Monument proposal. First, we'll look at option A, the Garden Monument proposal. This option involved the construction of a visitors' interpretive center in the central portion of the building. Included here would be 3 of the generators and some associated electrical equipment. The remaining electrical gear would be removed. Shown here is a view taken through the center of the building, looking downriver toward the falls. There was to be a room of exhibits, a theater for movies depicting appropriate information. On the left is the Niagara Parkway and the building main entrance, and one of the 3 remaining generators. This pretty much is the extent of the interpretive technology section. Below the generator floor was to be storage and washrooms. Outside the powerhouse building would have been a promenade with an inspiring view of the Niagara River Rapids just above the falls. The wings of the building would have had their roof removed. The outer walls would be retained, but the interior would be cleared of generators and associated electrical equipment. A garden would be planted, and the building would be maintained as a ruin. This proposal had gained the general support of both Ontario Hydro and the Niagara Parks Commission. Now we'll look at option B, the conservatory option. This option replicates the program from the Garden Monument option, but maintains the fabric of the building. The central area of the building is developed as a visitors' interpretive center for Ontario Hydro, and the wings are planted as an indoor garden greenhouse. Rather than demolish the roofs and walls of the building to create an outdoor garden, the roofs on either wing would be replaced with glass, and basic restoration would be carried out on the rest of the building. We'll compare the conservatory option to the Garden Monument option. Comparing the two, we can see some differences. On option A, the walls have been removed and the roofs of the wings being replaced with glass. On option B, the rear walls are intact. This perspective view shows the interior with only 2 generators left in place. According to the proposal, the basic components of the conservatory would be jungle themes forming a living backdrop to interpretive trails, Animals and birds would be added to give atmosphere. Next, we'll look at option C, the powerhouse option. The powerhouse option was intended to provide a cultural and technological attraction that would use the entire space of the Toronto Power Station as an interactive exhibit. This option would have been a third-generation science center related specifically to the subject of energy. At this point, the reuse study goes into great detail regarding scope. However, there was not much detail concerning the actual artifacts that would be involved. From the drawings, however, we can see that the intention was to produce a British-style engineering. Here we see the overhead crane left in place. However, much of the machinery has been removed to allow for interpretive displays. The plan view shows the walls intact. Although most of the generators have been removed, there is a generator display. What the intention of the Hall of Grand Machines was is a bit of a mystery. If you can ignore the palm trees, this section of the plant seems to indicate that much of the look and feel of a generating station will be maintained. Shown here is the 1985 invitation to the Toronto Power Open House. Reading from the flyer, you can see that it's based on the ideas presented in option C of the report. This open house is being held to obtain public comment about a concept to preserve and interpret this historic power station. The plan is to retain the important architectural features of this building and open it to the public as an electric museum and information center. It was the first Canadian hydroelectric development at Niagara Falls. The company was owned by three entrepreneurs known as the Syndicate, who were powerful opponents of Sir Adam Beck and the public power movement in the province, which led to the creation of Ontario Hydro. In the end, the Parks Commission did not choose the engineering proposal. In an article in the local paper, the December 21, 1987 Niagara Falls Review, the Kiwanis Club of Niagara Falls said, "It is unfortunate that the Niagara Parks Commission has chosen an Ontario Hydro plan which will lead to the disfigurement of the old Toronto powerhouse. The plan by the Niagara Falls Kiwanis Club would have kept the building intact but made the inside attractive. Hydro is going to open up the back, so anybody wanting to look at the river in winter must bundle up and brave the elements. If the hydro teardown plan is the best they can do, their standards need raising along with those of the Niagara Parks Commission, whose task is supposed to be to do everything possible to bring visitors here year-round and have facilities to induce them to stay a while." In 2026, the Parks Commission is planning a guest experience for this building. In their video, The Re-Imaging of the Power Station, they talk about the full restoration of the plant. Since all the electrical gear has been removed, I guess they mean full restoration of the building that is no longer a power station. How this will play out, only time will tell. And now the reference list, accompanied by the tune "The Meeting of the Waters," played on practice chanter by the pipe major of the Grimsby, Ontario Pipe Band, Gordon Scott.